Now, is that a clinical diagnosis of Alzheimer's? I don't think so. I think he got old. I think he got tired. When Nofziger told me, he got lazy. Wynne was sort of put out because he thought that, he said it would have been better for Reagan, but impossible for the country, for him to have been elected in 1976. Like just those extra 4 years. And the other thing he once told me was, when he was with Reagan in Sacramento, and he insisted, and Reagan performed very well at regular, frequent press conferences. And the wonderful thing about having to sit down with the press on a regular basis is it keeps you on your toes. It keeps you intellectually alert to what is going on throughout the vastness of your own administration and the federal government. It's a running battle of wits, if you will. And what happened when he came to Washington was he was surrounded by people who were afraid to let Reagan be Reagan. And they were very skillful in many ways, and they contributed, I think, significantly to the success of his presidency. But no one's perfect. And I think they were responsible, Nofziger believed at least, they were responsible for keeping Reagan cocooned, keeping him away from the press, from the regular exposure, the regular testing that a press conference provides. And consequently, he got rusty. And once he got rusty, he got lazy. Because none of us like to do things we don't like to do. And if you're a president, sitting in a room of 200 reporters is not a pleasant experience. And after all, you're the most powerful man in the world, so why should you have to do that? Yeah.
You mentioned George Washington, of course, and he was the one that set the precedent for 2 terms. And every president after him respected that precedent until FDR. Is your opinion, did FDR continue the terms more for a country in need or power lust, arrogance?
It's not either or. FDR, I think, wanted to go home to Hyde Park in 1939, 1940. But that same process that had begun, that I described earlier, almost by subterfuge, of preparing the American people for a war that he knew was coming, he believed in his heart, convinced him. I don't think it was a difficult effort to convince him that he was irreplaceable. There are those around the president who said he really believed that he would never die, and he might have sought a 5th term. But I think it's a combination of motives. I think if you look, though, the most likely Democratic nominee in 1940 was Cordell Hull, who had many admirable qualities, but electability was not one of them. And the Republicans, up until that time, were in the hands of isolationists like Bob Taft and Arthur Vandenberg before he underwent his road to Damascus conversion. So you had FDR, who believed that the fate of the world was at stake. And he looked around, he saw his own party, he saw the opposition party. Was it ego? Maybe. But in this instance, it was ego trumped by something much greater. And I think when you ask that question, you should then carry it and imagine what if he hadn't run. Lord only knows what would have happened. Yeah? Well, it's interesting. He asked about the similarities in the relationship between Roosevelt and Churchill and Reagan and Thatcher. Of course, the special relationship, so-called, really was born in this unique relationship that existed, then unique relationship between Roosevelt and Churchill. I never can remember whether it was Roosevelt to Churchill or Churchill to Roosevelt. I think it was Roosevelt to Churchill who said, "It's fun being in the same decade with you." There was a sense, they had met years before. Churchill professed not to remember because it had not gone well at all. And each thought the other kind of a braggart and a bully, and each had a point. But they became not only allies, but fast friends. At the same time, I think it's a mistake to sentimentalize the relationship. I talked about Lend-Lease. I talked about the swap of the 50 aging destroyers. Britain paid dearly for that lifeline. Those bases were permanently ceded. It accelerated the decline and the dispersal of the British Empire, certainly in the Western Hemisphere. FDR drove a hard bargain. So I think you can look at this relationship, which was very close, which was very historic, without, as I say, sort of sentimentalizing it. Now, 40 years later, certainly Reagan and Thatcher are leaders who, great admirers of Churchill. Reagan was a great admirer of FDR. I don't think Mrs. Thatcher probably thought much of Franklin Roosevelt or the New Deal. But they were both transforming leaders. I mean, all four of these people are. They're both agents of change, ironically, conservatives in the case of Reagan and Thatcher, who nevertheless represented dramatic change from their predecessors. I think they, in some ways, maybe wanted to believe that they were a modern equivalent of Roosevelt and Churchill. I think there was a little bit of sentimentality at work there. But again, you know, Ronald Reagan was no pushover. When, remember the invasion of Grenada? Grenada happened to be part of the British Empire. And there was a wonderful story of, you know, there's a time difference, of course, between London and Washington, 5 hours, I guess. And they're sitting in the Oval Office. Reagan gets a call from Mrs. Thatcher. And he's holding it sort of like here. And everyone in the Oval Office can hear the Prime Minister, who is not happy. And Reagan has a big smile on his face. I mean, he said, "Isn't she wonderful?" You know? I mean, now I think he had enormous respect for her. She had enormous respect for him. I think one of the most poignant things I've ever seen, I think the moment I will always remember from the Reagan funeral, was seeing Lady Thatcher defying her doctor's orders, flying across the Atlantic to pay her respects to her old friend and ally. And, but I would add one more name to that duo, and I would make it a trio, because I would add Pope John Paul II to the Reagan, Thatcher, John Paul trio, if you will, who changed the world in ways that even now we're only beginning to come to terms with. Yeah.